We are currently living in two distinct universes. The timeline has split, and somehow these two timelines are running right next to each other, overlapping, causing everyone's minds to break. The top story for this segment is that shootings and murders rose dramatically in NYC last week amid a backdrop of protests. Protests which are being supported overwhelmingly by the Democrats, who recently took a knee for about 9 minutes to support the protests. Meanwhile, in the other timeline, a dangerous pandemic is sweeping across the nation, and we are seeing a major spike. And for some reason, you've got people saying, we can't seem to understand why it is that these COVID cases are on the rise. Two distinct realities that seemingly make no sense. The other day on CNN, they're screaming, "Harumph, Donald Trump! He will not socially distance the press. This is a violation of CDC guidelines," they say. Meanwhile, they're out running coverage on the protesters, Chris Cuomo and their field reporters praising what the protesters are doing. Well, right now, in the anti-police version of reality, which we're going to focus on, there are major calls to abolish the police. We actually have historical reference to what happens when there are no police, and you're going to love it. It's the Purge, baby. Not kidding. It is the Purge. Apparently, like, rival businesses went and burned down rival business, like their opponents. Dude, crazy. This happened in Montreal. It's called the Murray Hill Riot. I'm going to read to you about what happened because it does seem like there are some similarities. There was mass protesting and high crime. The cops felt stressed and unsupported. So all the cops shut everything down, and then the city devolved into a purge. It breaks my heart that humans can't function properly. And I know all the libertarian friends I have are like, we don't need the police to function. I think we kind of do. Now, this story here, the lead is kind of short, but we're going to read this because this is where it begins. Shootings and murders rose dramatically in NYC last week amid backdrop of protests. They say, from the New York Post, really short story. From last Monday to Sunday night, there were 13 murders in the city compared to 5 during the same week last year. So that's more than double, almost triple. The city reported 40 shootings the last week, the most in a week since 2015. In the same time period in 2019, there were 24 shootings, sources said. The increase in violence came as demonstrators marched city streets to protest police killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. The majority of the protests were peaceful, but on some nights the demonstrations were overshadowed by looting and the destruction of stores in several boroughs. At least one shooting in Soho last Monday morning was linked to looters, police sources have said. And of course, here we can see the police, they doing their thing and they got their guns drawn. Now, I do think it's fair to point out there are a lot of peaceful protesters and there are looters and they are distinct. But there is an overlap. There are many ideologically driven looters and rioters. While this was going on, police resources were strained. And what happened was unfortunately predictable, especially for someone like me who is very liberty-minded, right? I very much fall on the libertarian spectrum. But the reality is simple. When most of the cops were too busy dealing with protests, the math is obvious, right? They can't be everywhere at once. You have a concentration of police resulting in the forces being spread thin, and then murders and shootings skyrocket. I'm willing to bet that there's also what also happened was muggings and other lethal instances of crime. I'm sure there were carjackings. I'm sure crime across the board went up. Now, some might argue this is due to the fact that we were under lockdown and now that we're out of lockdown, people are back in the streets. No. We're not talking about from a month ago. From a year ago when there was no lockdown, crime has just skyrocketed, in some instances doubling. And I'll tell you why. It's because the police couldn't be there to do anything about it. Now, listen, for the most part, when you're being a victim of a crime, the police come after the fact. But police are also a deterrent, especially when they're patrolling. So you could be safer if there's a criminal and they see you and there's a cop there, they're like, I might not do it. When the police are all in one area and everyone knows, now's their chance. They want to abolish the police. And this is what we're going to get. You think I'm joking, right? You think it's funny. Look, this is what you're going to get, man. You see this photo? Ariel Scarcella says, who are you going to call? This is the new Minnesota police squad. That's the joke going around. In this image, you can see students from Evergreen College wielding baseball bats. They think they're tough. They're not. They're just fanatics with weapons. You get rid of the police, you will replace them with fanatics with weapons. If you got a problem with police, the history of the formation of police, the laws around police, and the ideology that developed this country, hey man, I'm willing to listen to it. But if you want to tell me that you're going to replace one group of people you ideologically oppose with those you ideologically support, who are also these people, okay? They actually whacked a guy with a baseball bat. Why am I going to believe that corruption would go down when you bring together individualized community patrols that are going to do what they want to do, regardless of some overlapping federal authority? I mean, maybe they'll operate in that way. Sure, fine, whatever. But I do not want social justice police. Sorry, that's what they're going to make. Now, many people have brought this up to me, and I'd heard about it in the past, but I thought it'd be fun to pull up and explain what exactly will happen when they get rid of the police. I bring to you now the story of the Murray Hill riot. This is an amazing Wikipedia entry talking about the Montreal's Night of Terror. Now, I also want you to realize we're talking about peaceful old Canada, baby. Now, this is 1969. Fine. It was a police strike. Unfortunately, you can't read it all because of the way I have the image cropped, but I can read this. I'm going to read it to you. So it was 16 hours of unrest because the police, for one day, went on strike. And immediately, the city purged itself. I kid you not. This is a crazy story. The first thing I want to do is read to you from this entry how Steven Pinker describes it. You might know Steven Pinker. He's a very influential individual. I believe he's like an intellectual dark web type. And he talks about how he was an anarcho-lefty until this night when he realized that people will take every opportunity. And it's unfortunate, man, that we are a bunch of wild animals, I guess, huh? Humans going to do what they're going to do unless there are rules and agreement in place and people have deterrents, things like that. My favorite part of this story is how it wasn't just criminals looting to steal. It was a taxi service burning down a rival company. That's the purge, man. And this is what's going to happen. Let me read this for you. They say, Steven Pinker, the psychologist who was born and grew up in Montreal, recalled how the wildcat police strike and the lawlessness that followed changed his views. He said, as a young teenager in proudly peaceable Canada during the romantic 1960s, I was a true believer in Bakunin's anarchism. I laughed off my parents' argument that if the government ever laid down its arms, all hell would break loose. Our competing predictions were put to the test on 8 a.m., October 7th, 1969, when the Montreal police went on strike. By 11:20 a.m., the first bank was robbed. Only a couple hours. Wow. By noon, most of the downtown stores were closed because of looting. Within a few more hours, taxi drivers burned down the garage of a limousine service that competed with them for airport customers. A rooftop sniper killed a provincial police officer. Riots broke into several hotels and restaurants, and a doctor slew a burglar in his suburban home. By the end of the day, 6 banks had been robbed, 100 shops had been looted, 12 fires had been set, 40 carloads of storefront glass had been broken, and $3 million in property damage had been inflicted before city authorities had to call in the army and, of course, the Mounties to restore order. This decisive empirical test left my politics in tatters and offered a foretaste of life as a scientist. And right now, we have the Minneapolis City Council forming a veto-proof supermajority announcing they will abolish the police in Minneapolis. Okay, abolish, whatever it means, disband, dismantle, destroy, whatever. They getting rid of they cops. What do you think's going to happen to this town of Minneapolis when that happens? Let me tell you something. Peaceable Montreal couldn't handle it. We like to praise Canada. All of these lefties love to talk about how I'm moving to Canada. You're going to move to Canada, and then they never do. But they think that Canada's a better place. Okay, that's fine. Let's say Canada is a better place. Let's say Montreal is peaceful. Look at this. I love that story. A taxi driver burned down the garage of a limousine service. They were just going, that was just market competition, complete lawlessness. Who was going to stop you? Now, to be fair, the people who talk about the libertarian ideal of getting rid of the police do mention there would be private security keeping things in line. So, okay, I kind of get that. But I think right now we're not talking about that. We're talking about the Minneapolis police saying they will dismantle the police. I hope they don't do it overnight. They probably won't, but hey, man, these people are nuts if you were to ask me. They kind of just rush through everything without thinking through. As soon as that happens, Minneapolis will burn to the ground. It's different. A police strike is different. You know why? When the police announce they're going on strike, the people of that city say, now's my chance, but I better hurry because the strike could end. When the police are completely dismantled, they say, now's my chance and I'm going to enjoy it because ain't nobody coming back to stop me. What I'm trying to say is, in my opinion, in peaceable Canada, a lot of these people who were committing these crimes were like, we have to rush this and be very careful because you never know. The police are still there, just on strike. What happens when everyone knows there's no police at all? Not only that, they're talking about, getting people out of prison, reforming prisons and things like that. I'm all for reforming prisons and reforming police, but they're talking about releasing criminals and inmates and things like this. I'll tell you what's going to happen when you dump a bunch of convicts into a city like they've already done in St. Louis, mind you. The attorney general said all of the people they arrested for rioting and looting had been released previously from the jails over COVID. And here you go. So the story of this, I don't want to read too much, but I want to give you a bit of the opening context as to why they say it was happening. Let me just read the intro for you. They say the Montreal's Night of Terror was the culmination of 16 hours of unrest in Montreal, Quebec, during a strike by the Montreal police on 7th of October. Police were motivated to strike because of difficult working conditions caused by disarming FLQ-planted bombs and patrolling frequent protests. Montreal police also wanted higher pay, commensurate with police earnings in Toronto. In addition, the mayor of Montreal, Jean Drapeau, who had been elected as a reformer who had promised to clean the city up by cracking down on corruption, turned out to be no different from his predecessors, leaving many people disillusioned. Drapeau's focus on grandiose projects such as Expo 67, instead of trying to improve the daily lives of Montrealers, had also added to the frustration. Journalist Nick Off-Dermore wrote that by 1969, amongst the working class of Montreal, there was a feeling that Drapeau only cared about building the gleaming, modernistic skyscrapers that dominated the city's skyline while being indifferent to their outcome, to their concerns and needs. Okay. In Buffalo recently, there was an incident where a 75-year-old man walked up to some cops. They yell at him, push him. He stumbles back, falls over, hits his head, and bleeds out of the ear. 2 of the officers have been charged with second-degree assault, and they have been suspended. In response, 57 other cops announced they were resigning in support of these cops. What people don't realize, and they're trying to deflect this, is that while I think the old man should have been handled much better. And I think there should be, I don't necessarily agree with second degree assault, but there should be some charges or some kind of penalty. Maybe it's just a suspension. Maybe an internal inquiry to reform some of the practice they take, dealing with individuals, something like that. But it turns out this guy in Buffalo was out on the street arguing with some of the protesters who were like, there's literally a video of a Black Lives Matter dude being like, this guy's trying to start a fight, man. And so I don't know exactly who that guy is or why, but they believe this guy came down and was just being contrarian and arguing with people and things like that. So whatever happened, it seems like he was looking to rile people up, not that he deserved to be pushed by the cops. But 57 cops resigning isn't the entire police force. We are seeing a slow trickle out. There have been a bunch of rumors circulating of Minneapolis police resigning in mass or retiring. I gotta say, man, I can't confirm all that, but I believe it. There have been some journalists who have pointed out in New York, about 6 police are resigning per day. It's really, really high, but not necessarily really high right now. And there's probably a big waiting list to become a cop in New York. But I'll tell you this, man. I can't imagine a lot of people want to be cops right now. When we saw in Minneapolis that I think it was the 3rd precinct get raided and all the cops stormed at the back and ran away, I'm sure the first thing they did when they got home was they took off that uniform and put on regular clothes and said, I'm not a cop. Don't look at me. Who would want to be a cop right now when your city won't defend you? When you're not even paid that well? When you're risking criminal liability for what's going on in the streets? Look, man, I don't like police brutality. I think some of these cops have done really, really stupid things. There's that video of the guy getting shot in the face point blank with tear gas. That's insane. But some of these cops, like the Buffalo ones, they clearly didn't want to knock the guy to the ground. I think they can get some penalty, but I think the penalty has more to do with administration, not criminal. Listen, if you walk up to me and start bickering and yelling, and I push you and you fall, I'm gonna get in trouble, okay? But you will likely get some kind of slap on the wrist. You're not, a second degree assault, not the biggest deal in the world, to be honest. But the fact that, I don't know, man, to me it feels like, look, there's an argument about police, that we ask them to go into situations where they're in danger. And this results in violent confrontation and people lose their lives. I think the police are too cavalier with this. And we've seen some stories, like there's one video where a guy gets pulled over and ordered out of his van. He gets out of the van, he's got his hands up, and the cop says, show me your ID or whatever. And he goes, okay, it's right here. And he says, grab it. He goes to grab it, and the cop freaks out and starts shooting him. It's like, you told him to get his ID. Like, if you tell someone to grab something, what are you going to shoot him for? Then there's also, I believe it was Philando Castile, legal gun owner, in his car, permit and everything, and the cop just freaked out and shot him. So look, there are instances where cops have been too cavalier because they're immune. How do we find that right balance? I'll tell you what, I honestly don't know. It's really, really difficult situation. But I'm totally for reform. And I think because we want to figure out ways where, look, we have to compromise, you know? How can we make cops feel safer and more respected and be propped up as the heroes they once were, officer friendly and all that stuff? We need to reassess this as our cities start growing and getting bigger and we deal with these issues. I want to read a little bit following what Steve Pinker said, so that because they mentioned the taxi incident. Here's what they say. As the police were on strike, a crowd of disgruntled taxi drivers belonging to the Movement de Libération du Taxi appeared outside of City Hall at about 6 p.m., supporting the police strike, carrying banners denouncing the mayor, Jean Drapeau, as being corrupt. After the rally, the taxi drivers formed a convoy that were escorted by the Popeyes Motorcycle Club, the most violent of all of Montreal's many outlaw biker clubs. Joining the convoy were journalists and members of the FLQ, carrying banners demanding independence for Quebec. On the street, the convoy encountered a Murray Hill limousine that was forced to stop. The passengers and driver were allowed to leave, and then the car was smashed to pieces by the taxi drivers and the Popeyes. The reason why I wanted to read that to you is because right now there is a huge conflict between taxi drivers and Uber drivers. If there are no police, I assure you, man, there have been stories in New York. What happens is, and France especially, real in France for sure. I remember being told this a couple of years ago when Uber was like really contentious. I don't know if it's still legal there, what's going on. Taxi drivers would call an Uber from the airport, get in the Uber and give them an address that was kind of remote. And when the Uber driver pulled up, a bunch of cab drivers would beat the crap out of the Uber driver and smash up their car because the Uber drivers were destroying the taxi driver's business. It's funny to see this happening now because we got the same powder keg sitting around. Now, we don't have an FLQ planting bombs, but the cops were stressed out by corruption, bad politics. They wanted more pay, and there were a lot of protests. So naturally, this is what you end up getting. You are going to see, I don't know, man, utter bedlam is the only way to put it. But hey, I guess every so often somebody wants to embark on the experiment. So let me tell you this. If you would like to experiment with the process of dismantling your police department to see if we will still get a Montreal Night of Terror-like moment in your town, feel free to do it, because I don't live there. And if you do live there and you don't speak up in support of the police, don't be surprised when they resign, and then you end up with a Minneapolis Night of Terror. To be honest, you're already getting it. It's a rock and a hard place, to say the least. You got cops who just killed a guy, and that's messed up. But the cops have all been arrested. The 3 cops kneeling on George Floyd are being charged with aiding and abetting. And the cop who put his knee on the neck is getting charged with second-degree murder. We'll see if the charges make it because they upped them, which is, you can't please the mob, man. But let me just tell you, you want to avoid a mob? You want to avoid riots? So you agree to dismantle the police? That just makes no sense. You're agreeing to more rioting and more mobbing. To see the Democrats all kneeling. You see this video of Schumer and Pelosi and everybody kneeling? I'm like, bow before your new religion. They're captives. The religion demands blood and they will give it. To see American politicians to their knees should be alarming to anybody. America is the country that says we kneel before no one. We refuse to kneel before a king and kiss the pinky ring. So we said enough and we severed ties. Now, we have a political party, the Democrats, that has become increasingly unhinged and is bending the knee specifically to a new ideology. I understand that conservative Christians bend the knee to their Lord and Savior. But guess what? We have a separation of church and state, which has allowed secularists and atheists and agnostics to fight for the position of equality and justice under the law. That while there is still Christian ideology as a big piece of our legal system, it certainly is. Look up the history of Blackstone's formulation. Ultimately, what it comes down to is we can resist the deeper ideological tenets of the religion. But we can't stop social justice dogma because it's not technically a religion. I mean, it is. It's a non-theistic religion. People shouldn't be bowing in the Capitol building, and our laws shouldn't be defined by cult ideology. But it's not religion. And you can't separate ideology from law because ideology is just how people see the world. So ultimately, what's going to happen? The Democrats will bend the knee. Murders and crimes will skyrocket. The police are about to be disbanded in Minneapolis. And then the grand experiment will commence once again. And perhaps it will all lead to a Trump smashing re-election victory. I don't know. I do think it's really funny that a poll came out from Rasmussen showing that Trump's support among the black community hit 40%. I find it hard to believe, man. I really do. Really, really do. But it was floating around 30 according to several polls, including Emerson. It's funny to see that these numbers come out, and all of a sudden, what happens? Race riots, Black Lives Matter. Trump put together a tribute to George Floyd. Twitter took it down. I wonder why they did that. Maybe it's because they don't want Trump to win. I guess we'll see. I guess we'll see what happens to Minneapolis, huh? Stick around. The next segment's coming up at 4 p.m. over at timcast.net. It is my main channel. If you haven't subscribed, check it out, and I will see you all there.